All right. Well, we have been talking through the how important it is to understand the spheres that God has created in the world, and it's it's not exactly the same as sphere sovereignty. There's a little bit of overlap because what I'm talking about is the poetic spheres that God gives us in Eden, and then He references back to throughout the rest of the Bible. He references back to the garden, to the land, to the wilds, to the wilderness, right? He references these spheres in order to be able to communicate to us what it is that Adam is supposed to be doing, and Adam and all of his descendants are supposed to be doing in the world as we're moving from garden to land to wilderness through the generations. But we also see that Jesus sets up himself and his kingdom um, in a way that it looks like, he shows that he is returning to the garden, right? That he is the new Adam returning his people to the garden so that they will be fed and fulfilled the way Adam, um, what in a way that Adam failed, the first Adam failed. So there's a popular myth that you still actually run into regularly that comes from the Greek, comes from Hesiod, and some other places, but you actually see this particular myth in a lot of different um, cultures and a lot of different historical peoples and language groups. Historical people groups have this same myth, and it's Chronos as a titan, right? Chronos as a titan. Now, Chronos means time. And what you have with the titan Chronos is that Chronos is the titan who he has a bunch of children that are born from him, and then is the one that eats them all. And he's also the one that Zeus has to trick and in order uh, to protect the gods, and it's the overthrowing of Chronos that makes Zeus into the king of the gods. Right? He overthrows the Titan time. And you can see that in just a very straightforward way, that's saying that if um, a, a man, a creature, can overcome time, then he becomes a god, right? That time is the realm of created things, right? Time is the measure of change. And this is why it is so important that God is outside of time. Time is not a thing, right? Time is an adjective, right? Time is a measurement of change of things. But we see that the Greeks understood, and lots of different people understood, that time was an enemy of mankind so long as death ruled and reigned on the earth. Right, so Kronos, time, eats all his children. He is the eating lord. He's the eating titan of history. Well, when Jesus shows up, he is also said to be, he shows up as the Lord of history. And the resurrection is centrally important to understand that he has overcome time because he's overcome death. And time ceases to be an enemy once death is overcome, because then time becomes a the measure of change in a positive direction, not just the measure of change in a negative direction. But Jesus, when he shows up as Lord, he shows up as the feeding Lord of history. Right? Chronos is the eating Lord of history. Jesus is the feeding Lord of history. And we see this, just in the fact that it all leads to the wedding supper of the Lamb, but also, Revelation 19. You've got the Jesus, the central image of the Jesus as ruler is Jesus as the one who feeds and takes care of. But also, right in the middle of the Gospels, you have Jesus over and over. He feeds people, right? People gather to him, he feeds them. Gather, there's not enough loaves and fishes. He multiplies the loaves and fishes. He's the kind of Lord, he's the kind of king that makes sure everybody has food. And in fact, there's an overflow of food when Jesus is Lord, right? He is the feeding Lord of history. Um, And it's one of the things that is really set apart when you see John the Baptist's head cut off and delivered on a feeding platter, right? You have Herod, he is the one who is eating God's people, whereas Jesus is the one immediately on hearing that story, you get the story of Jesus taking people out and feeding them in the wilderness, right? So one is in a palace and he's surrounded by food, but he still eats God's people. That's the kind of king Herod is. And then Jesus is the kind of king that even in the wilderness, his overflowing generosity fills everybody to the full. Well, those different understandings are really important because it's two different kinds of homes that you can set up, right? You can set up the kind of home where the parents and the children are rivals with one another, right? The way Chronos eats his own children, right? That he sees his that Chronos sees his children as rivals, and in order to find the kind of freedom that Zeus and the other gods need to have, they actually have to overthrow Chronos. And this is a really common theme in Greek mythology and Roman mythology, a little less in Roman mythology, but it's still there. But in lots of different ancient understandings, the parents and the children were rivals with one another, right? Because the children were going to replace the parents. And if things went poorly, they replaced them sooner rather than later by means of murder. And so often the parents would murder their own children in order to just defend their place in the world because they were going to be replaced. But if the children came up quicker, well, then they were going to be replaced sooner. Well, Jesus shows us a different kind of lordship, a lordship, a kingship, a rulership of overflowing generosity, of overflowing love, where there isn't a rivalry, because when Jesus is Lord, the people that he is under, they flourish, right? And their flourishing is something that he rejoices in. In fact, that's the goal. Jesus is not a successful evangelist in his ministry. He's not. Now, it's we're told that the reason is because that wasn't his main job, right? He didn't come primarily as an evangelist. He came as the one he came as the priest and the king and the sacrifice. He came as the prophet. He came as the one making the new covenant. He came as a lot of things, but what he didn't come at as is the great evangelist. But he tells his disciples that they are going to be the ones who go out and convert the world, right? And when he says, I'm going away to create a house, you're going to go out and fill it, he says, I'm going to send the Holy Spirit to you, and he is going to give you power to do my will on the earth. And he says, you are going to rejoice at the presence of the Holy Spirit. There isn't a rivalry between the work of the Son and the work of the Spirit. The work of the Spirit continues the work of the Son, pushes it forward, glorifies the work of the Son, it applies the work of the Son, but there isn't ever a rivalry. And at the heart of the relationship between parents and children should be a rivalryless love. Right, and a rivalryless love. And what that means is that the goal is for your children to go further than you, right? The goal is to for your children to go beyond what you could do, and then you rejoice in that, right? That your children, they start behind you, right? They're walking right behind you. You're guiding them, you're directing them. They are following you, but throughout time, they move off to the side from you. They're still pointing in the same direction. They're still following you, but they're gaining some freedom. They're seeing the world in a different way, not just directly by means of you. And then they move up next to you and they become friends and equals. Right? They move out of the house. They get married. They start their own families. Right? And you're no longer in an authority. In a position of authority over your children. Now, hopefully, if things are going well, what you want to end up is a welcome advisor to your children. But the goal is always for your children to move out from behind you, move up next to you, and charge off into the world. And hopefully they go beyond you, right? That they are better Christians than you ever were, that they understand better what the God is calling them to, that they accomplish more in their lives than you did, right? That's what you want. You want them to go beyond you. That won't happen if you're in competition with your children, right? But the beginning of that is understanding the overwhelming generosity of Christ as Lord of the family. He gives abundantly beyond what we need, right? He gives us, he is the kind of generous Lord whose overflowing generosity flows beyond us to our children and to our children's children. And that embrace of the generosity of God is the beginning of what turns our tables into generous places, right? Turns our tables into patient places. You know, when our kids don't understand or they don't buy into something that we have been teaching them right away, right? When they come and they say, "Oh well, you Dad, you believe that uh, the American Revolution was justified, and I think that they should have stuck with the British, right? That you don't have to come down on them hard in that moment, right? And say, no, you're in my house. No royalist is going to be sitting at my table. I don't know if that is the kind of thing anybody's ever going to run into, but you can be patient and have a discussion. Say, why is it that you think that? Because if they turn out to be right, you're not in competition with them, right? So you can have the kinds of discussions that says, why do you think that? Well, here's what I think about that, right? You can build the generous conversation of in the context of a life-giving love around the table where you're feeding them, you're training them, you're teaching them, you're giving them a good education, you're doing everything you can to set them up so that they'll be better off than you as they launch into life. And their victory is your victory. Uh, Anything that they accomplish, you get to rejoice in, right? It doesn't have because they're not an accessory to your life, right? They are their own person before the Lord, and the generous nature of uh, God's ruling, right? Jesus as the most generous of all lords, the most generous God as the Father is the most generous of all fathers. I mean, even God the Father. Think about this, right? When God the Father opens the heavens above Christ as he's getting baptized, there's no rivalry. He says, "This is my beloved Son, my well loved Son." In whom I am pleased. Hear him. Right? This is my beloved son, my well-loved son. Right? God the Father doesn't say, well, if you're listening to Jesus, you're going to be listening to me less, right? That doesn't even make any sense to think of rivalry between father and son. But because of sin, the rivalry between father and son, there's a temptation to let it develop. And some of that comes when you think that there's going to be limited resources, and so you're in competition with your children for those resources. Some of it comes when you think are the one that has to be the center of the story and the center of their story. That your family unit has to be the center of their story forever, right? But that all happens when we forget, um, when we come to God thinking that there's a limited amount of resources, there's a limited amount of love, there's a limited amount uh, for us to have, but also that there's a limited amount of time, right? That mindset that Chronos eats his children, that we have a limited amount of time, right? Jesus was raised from the dead, and he's going to be raised from the dead. And so when he tells us that he is the bread of life, it's so that we know that our hunger, even if it's unfulfilled this side of death, that in everlasting life we will have plenty of time. right? We will have plenty of time. And so when you have those moments where your grown children have to choose between your house and their in-laws' house for Christmas, right? And you feel like, but we don't get as much time with the in-laws, right? It's you're running into the temptation to think that Chronos is God, right? That time is eating you, and you're not going to survive it, and you're forgetting that the everlasting life is a table full of fellowship, right? It's a greater than any Christmas that you're going to have together, right? So it's a good thing to want your children home for Christmas, your grown children home for Christmas. Um, but when you let those rivalries grow up, the rivalries all grow out of a lack of belief in the generosity of God and the eternality of life after death. So with that said, remembering that Chronos, the eating Lord of history, is not God anymore. Once Jesus was raised from the dead, Jesus took over history. He took over. He became Lord of time, potentate of time, as one of our poets and hymnists has said. And that the wedding supper of the Lamb, that family meal, is a central picture of what's coming, um, and that our culture around our home should grow out of Jesus as the feeding Lord of history. The generosity of God is should be what is on display at our tables, at our in our families, and there shouldn't be any room for rivalry if that's the case.